Hey everybody, let's talk about deep versus wide gameplay. People kind of throw these terms around without ever defining them, and I think that there's a lot of misunderstandings as to what these terms mean, and there's a lot more nuance than you might think. So I figured I could talk about it a little bit. Let's chat about some design stuff. Let's see if we can kind of hone our design game just a little bit. I guess we can start with Space Engineers. So Space Engineers is a kaleidoscope of interesting design decisions, which makes it fun to discuss. In Space Engineers, you engineer things in space. Here's your spaceship. You could put in some space engines and some space reactors and some space cargo containers and some space guns and some space jump drives. Whatever you can think of, you can put it into your spaceship because that is the name of the game. You are space engineering. The new content was just released. What's the new content? Infantry combat. Oh yeah, get your boots on the ground. Grab your space guns and shoot at other space people with their space boots on the ground. Pew, 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 pew. What exactly that's got to do with space engineering is unknown, but normally we would kind of categorize this DLC as wide and shallow, right? It's not related to the core play of the game. It's just adding in some stuff off to the side that just like shows up. It exists because they needed more content in the game rather than to make the game more interesting. Right? Right? Wrong. In this case, that's not true. For very stupid reasons. Let's talk about it. The studio that's developing Space Engineers is named Keen. They developed a different game alongside Space Engineers called Medieval Engineers. Medieval Engineers was accidentally genius. I've talked about it before. They ruined that because they didn't realize what they'd made. And instead, they tried desperately to find some way to make it appeal to people, and the only thing they could think of was, you guessed it, infantry combat. Rah! Now, after they introduced infantry combat and focused the game around it, nobody played it ever again. Brilliant choice. Anyway, the new DLC for Space Engineers focusing on infantry combat is definitely going to go great. But there is one important thing to consider here. Infantry combat was already in Space Engineers. You see, Keen is not the most careful dev. They are a very kitchen sink dev. They just throw in whatever seems to be interesting, and they end up with 10,000 different pieces that don't really fit together, but usually one or two of those pieces will end up gelling, and you'll end up getting some depth completely by sheer coincidence. And that's exactly what happened in both Medieval Engineers and in Space Engineers. But the problem is, the devs don't really know what they've got. They didn't do it on purpose. And there's no clearer example of that than the fact that 90% of the things in their games are just flat, uninteresting, shallow things that don't really gel at all. And infantry combat has always been one of those things in Space Engineers. It's not fun. There's a lot of reasons for that. Partially it's the incredibly bad multiplayer support, and partially it's just the fundamental way in which they do damage modeling and stuff like that. But it's just never been very interesting. People still play it because everybody loves a first-person shooter, apparently. But, if you compare it to an actual game that's focused on that sort of thing, it's not even close. They're very primitive. So here's the new DLC. What are they trying to do? They're trying to fix their infantry combat. They're trying to make it interesting. They're trying to add depth to something in their game that didn't have any depth. It's not related to the part of the game that is already deep. So what is it? Is it deep? Is it wide? Is it shallow? Is it all three? What's going on? How can you define this? Well, that's the thing. When you say deep or wide or shallow, it's always going to be a judgment that you're making relative to some ideal that you have in mind. And in this case, I'm focused on the spaceship design, the space engineering. So to me, any sort of focus on combat is likely to be considered wide and shallow because I consider combat to be inherently a very shallow sort of gameplay. But in this case, they are, in fact, deepening the combat side of the game. Complicated, right? Well, let's switch gears a little bit. Let's talk about why they did this. Let's talk about Satisfactory. Satisfactory is a clone of a game called Factorio. There are many clones of Factorio, things like Shapes.io and Mindustry, and they're usually very, very complicated, deep games full of really complex topological challenges and chains of operations that are very interesting. Satisfactory doesn't do that. Satisfactory is a shallow clone, and by that I mean that they took the nuances of Factorio and carefully cut them away. They explicitly made Satisfactory a more shallow game on purpose. Why? Streaming. Yeah. Satisfactory is a streaming-focused game. It is intended to look as good as possible on someone else's computer screen. If you play, Factorio or Shapes.io, you're not really going to be able to stream it. You can, no one's going to care, right? No one's going to say, oh, look at that long line of things you've built. That's very impressive. That's not going to show up very well on the screen. But Satisfactory is very pretty. And you can create things in Satisfactory without pushing yourself too hard, and the result will be lots of very pretty long tubes and stuff, and it'll be great fun, right? It'll look great on the screen, even though the depth isn't there. Satisfactory released a new DLC pack, or maybe it was just new content, very recently. It introduces some new buildings and some new visuals for how to move things around. It adds almost no gameplay. But what it does add is a bunch of new, very pretty visuals that streamers can get to within 10 minutes. If you add depth to your game, the streamers might not understand it. And even if they do understand it, it might take them hours to really plummet. From the perspective of trying to get people to jump into the game. Oh, look, we got some new DLC. Let's get some new players. Let's get some players that exist to come back for the DLC. Well, then you want to focus on that first 10-minute punch. You want the streamers to be able to say, look at this new content. I made a nuclear reactor. So you have to make it as easy as possible for them to make that nuclear reactor, because you want everybody to see that nuclear reactor and go, I want a nuclear reactor. And then they buy the game DLC and they're like, oh, it's just the same thing, but with a different input. Well, you already bought it. Good enough. I'm not going to say that wide content is inherently disappointing. There are a lot of cases where a wider set of content is very valuable, but the thing is that you don't have to choose between them. You can do both. And Space Engineers is a good example. Their most recent DLC is kind of a good example of doing both. They are, in fact, trying to improve a part of their game that many players wish was better. At the same time, they're adding content. So that is a situation where Space Engineers is trying to do the best of both worlds. That's a new strategy for them, because normally they don't. Normally they try and do the least of both worlds. Let me give you an example. For a long, long time, Space Engineers was a slow game, and I mean that in the most basic way possible. There was a speed limit. You couldn't break the speed limit. It was hard-coded into the game. Their speed of light is 100 meters a second in this game, which sounds like a lot. It's not when your spaceships are huge, right? But for a long time, they didn't really care, because what are you going to do? Space is just a big pile of floating rocks. Are you going to try and travel faster to a different floating rock? There's nothing different over there from over here. Why are you in such a hurry, So for a long time, spaceships remained very, very slow. But eventually, they kind of got the drift, and they started to add in some more stuff. They added in some planets, and they added in a jump drive. A jump drive is a big block that you can use to teleport your ship to a new location. It's got some constraints and some stuff like that, but fundamentally it's all about moving to a new location very, very fast rather than at 100 meters a second. Problem is, it doesn't add any depth or width. I mean, technically it adds width because it exists, but it doesn't add any new frame for seeing content or anything like that. So let me give you some examples here. Planets are great, right? Planets are different than space. If you land on a planet, you're going to get to do things that you couldn't do in space. You're going to have experiences that you wouldn't have in space because there's gravity and ground and a whole bunch of other things like that, right? So you land on a planet, you shake off from the planet, whatever. Obviously, traveling to and from planets would be a great use of the jump drive. That's why they disabled it. You can't use a jump drive anywhere near a planet. You have to spend about half an hour thrusting straight away from the planet before your jump drive clears up and is able to jump you anywhere. But you can jump from the middle of nowhere to the middle of nowhere. There's no difference in space. It's all the same rocks, just generated randomly. There's no reason to go anywhere in space. So the jump drive literally takes you from nowhere to nowhere. Great. Okay, well, maybe it's interesting in terms of the ship design, right? Like maybe this introduces some new constraints into how we think about designing our ships. Oh, no, you just slot in the jump drive and then you can jump. That's it. I mean, it takes a while to charge. If you are very, very careful with your energy and you're making like a solar ship, it might be an energy concern, but most of the time it's not. So it doesn't change your ship design much. Great. So this is a piece of content that added no depth and no width. There's no content that relies on your jumping. There's no content that is enabled by your jumping or improved by your jumping. You can technically create missions where jumping has some value, but that would be you could also create those missions so that jumping didn't. You could create those missions around not jumping. It would be the exact same experience. It's one of those situations where it is an extraordinarily limited application. And it would have been so easy to make this either deep or wide. You could make it wide by making space have different zones. Like, oh, are you jumping towards the sun? Well, you get into the solar flare zone, or you get into this zone, which is full of space hail, or whatever, right? That would make the content wider because you could now use your ship to go to more complicated, interesting places. Or you could make it work within the planetary gravity well. But of course, if you warp into like a physical object, you will crater or something similar. There are lots of options. Or you could make it so that you have other content that's related to jumping. Like you jump and it lures pirates to you because they can see the jumping or something like that. There's lots of ways to add content layered into the jump mechanics. There are also ways that you could make it deeper. For example, you could make it so that there's a particular sphere around the jump drive, and any part of your ship that's outside that sphere doesn't come with you. So if your ship is too big, you got to add another jump drive. Or maybe you make it so that your jump drives cause this like microwave EM pulse within a certain range of the jump drive itself and turn off all of your gear for 30 seconds or something after the jump. So you try and like put the jump drive off to the side or away from anything valuable or something like that. Or, you got other concerns you could do. You could add almost anything to this jump drive mechanic to try and make these jump drives change how you design your ships, add some depth to the design constraints. None of that happened. The only thing the jump drives do is they're a little bit power hungry. Woo! But the jump drives do one thing that's very important. You see, you can go ahead and build a jump drive ship from the workshop in like 5-10 seconds just by using the creative mode build function. And then you can hit jump and the ship will go boy, it looks great on stream, doesn't it? Yeah, that's it. It looks good on stream. So as you can see, focusing on stream content doesn't require you to be wide or deep. You can be completely worthless and still have something that focuses on what looks good for the stream. So this is a very complicated or chaotic situation where you can talk about depth, you can talk about width, you can talk about shallowness or off-center development, or not focusing on the core of the game, or focusing on the core of the game, or focusing on streamers or not focusing on streamers. And I just want us to have a wider view. I want us to think about these things in terms of why the devs did what they did and how they might have done something different in a different situation or with a different focus or with a more competent team in certain cases. But it's one of those situations where it's very rarely useful to say that something is deep or shallow or wide unless you're going to explain your context, unless you're going to explain the direction you're coming at it from. And I'm sure that there are people out there who think that the jump drive added a lot of depth, different context. Anyway, that was fun. Have a good day.